entitled to the money?
Well, first of all, I think people have to be reminded that in 1996, I was taken out for coffee, and many years in recreation and sport, was asked to take responsibility for the public libraries branch. 4 days later, I had to go to the library conference and be introduced. And most of the people at the library conference thought that I was going to show up in my sweatpants with a basketball under my arm. I tried to show up with a brochure that I handed out to people, telling them what I believed in and what I thought I could do for public libraries. During that first year, I watched a lot of library activity. I listened to a lot of politicians. And one day I said to the library community, and I will edit this, that you don't have a right to the money. And that began a really interesting process of us talking about telling your stories and what politicians really thought about public libraries. And it was just an odd phrase to use to get things started and to break the ice.
So the important thing is to tell our story, tell library stories in a way that when funders have to make decisions about money, they have good information. That we need to make sure that they understand our perspective. We need to make sure that they understand our value, and they need to actually understand what we do. But from our perspective, we also need to think about who you're competing with for the money and explain why your cause is as important or more important than theirs. And so the bottom line for me is, if funders give us money, how do we help them to meet their goals? One of the things that in the next slide you'll see is a really interesting report. It's a group that watches Alberta municipal spending. And it's a useful thing to look into and see how your municipality is doing in terms of balancing the money they have coming in and the money that they have going out. And that's something that can help you think ahead to what's likely to happen in the next few years, because libraries compete with fire departments and libraries compete with road paving and things like that. So you need to understand how that money works in your community and go forward with it. So funding at the community level, those funders also have to think about their sustainability.
I think too, you have to realize that libraries are competing at all levels. It's not just locally. You're competing regionally against other groups. You're competing inside the provincial government. You're competing with every other government department. And so all the way along the line, you really do have to understand who your competition is, and I guess how you're going to be tell your story better than they tell their story.
Absolutely. And part of that is just understanding where the money goes, but how much money there is, and understanding how your story is going to have to be pitched. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. The second big point we wanted to make is that change sometimes happens very, very fast. And I'm going to start with a story from my background. When I was at Parkland Regional Library, we went to bed one night and everything was just fine. We woke up the next morning to discover that the government had changed the taxing authority for the school boards. And so overnight we went from being financially stable to being broke, and started on a year-long campaign to try and deal with that. So that's what we mean by fast. You'll see that Wheatland County had a surprise this week, and fortunately it's been reversed. But the reason we're talking about this is your library should have a briefing book with information about the library, so you know how to respond really fast to things as they arrive fast. So Punch, do you have a...
Well, the government people have, I think that's one of the strengths that we brought to the table, was the ability to create briefing books at the drop of a hat. when a new minister would be put in place, there would be the need for a briefing book, a giant briefing book. There would be a need for deputy ministers on specific issues. The most famous briefing book, though, that I can remember was the one that I created for myself when I took over responsibility for the libraries branch. I had this massive, it was at least 4 inches thick briefing book on every aspect of public libraries. And I started on the 1st of May, and Shirley McClellan took over responsibility for libraries on the end of May. We got together on an airplane and we're flying up north, and I had my massive briefing book, and I handed it to the minister, and she kind of looked at me over her glasses and said, "Who's this book for?" And I said, "Well, I guess it's really for me." And she said, "Well, what was the intent?" And I said, "Well, the intent was for us to develop a plan." 45 minutes later, she had torn the table of contents out, and we had developed a 3-year strategy for how we were going to work together. But it was all based on this fantastic briefing book.
So now Punch has sold you on that. We have to remember that one of the great things about technology is you don't have to build this thing by yourself, right? You can get together with your partners and you can share back and forth pieces that belong in a briefing book. I guess I'd like to say here that while it's good to be able to respond to change, it's even better to start your advocacy before the crisis occurs. So part of it is just doing your homework and trying to predict what's going to happen. So for those of you who missed the story about Wheatland County, there's the first half of it. If you look online, you'll find the second half, which is when council changed their mind. One of the things, though, to think here is about the need for coordination. So not only does your library need a strategy to respond, but it should be coordinated with if your system library, if you're a system member, with other partners, and as you're going to hear from us later, hopefully across the province. So our next we tried to make 10 good steps. The next big thing to think about is, I always call it follow the money, and make sure that you know inside out where your money comes from and the conditions attached. And so I've given you an example right now based on what's happened in some other provinces. When you read stories in the news about other provinces and library funding, the thing to remember is that Alberta gets very little, Alberta libraries get very little direct service from the province. And so the likelihood of a direct service necessarily being cut. But for example, the one that all libraries depend on is, what would happen if, for example, the government courier disappeared? What would impact? Do you have a story about that? Is that something that, if you even heard the flicker of a rumor about that, you'd be out there with your story? Because you need to be able to tell the story. What I have found in my career is that telling people a number about money doesn't get it. So one of my one of my friends called me last night, and she said she'd just been through a painful meeting with a council who was, upset about a 2% increase in the cost of the library, but it was actually $45. And so being able to tell the story about what does this actually mean in a terms that people can understand is probably much more important than just being able to give the numbers. So Punch?
I guess the impact of cuts, the ability to respond in a positive way to politicians so that they do understand, as Margaret said, they do understand the impact of what a cut means. On the other side, though, I think that you should always have a contingency plan for surprise cuts, that you should know very quickly what your contingency plan is and how you would survive in the interim before before you would be successful in getting the funds back.
Okay, but the other thing is to be very realistic and trying to avoid the sky is falling kind of a response to everything, and really think out. Now, one of the things that often funders forget is that some of that money is matching grants. And so I had worked, for example, one time with a small municipality who said, we're going to pull out our funding and just let the provincial funding carry the day, because they had actually forgotten the fact that it's a matching grant, and it didn't work that way. So one of the questions that we often get asked when we're talking about funding, and it came up in the Wheatland story, was the question of user pay. And is user pay a good idea? And lo and behold, if you look on the municipal affairs site at PLSB, there's an answer to that question. And so make sure that you have looked at those resources and thought through, how do you answer the questions that you're likely to get? And that just seems to be one that comes around all the time.
Just a reminder that the fact that Alberta still has the ability to put in a user pay policy. It started in 1937 when there was a loophole was created to allow for the charging of library cards. The people didn't actually charge even when they had that loophole until the early 1990s, when the provincial government's funding began to fall further and further behind. And then one of the libraries decided that they would exercise their right and try to make up the difference by having user pay. I think that the province has done a tremendous job. The library community in the province has done a tremendous job in moving away from user pay for the library cards. But it's something that you always have to keep in mind, and that URL that Margaret's put up there is something you should check.
Yeah, what it goes into is, does user pay actually make any money by the time you consider the costs of collecting it? So those are the kinds of arguments that you would hope to have. On to number 4. Can you answer the question, how does your library add value? And you need to know how it adds value at every different level. So how does it add value to the province and the provincial government? How does it add value to your community and to individuals? And which one of these outcomes do funders care about? Because a whole lot about advocacy is based on a huge biological theory of selective attention, which is that people pay attention to things they care about. Just like if you're at a party and it's noisy, you hear your name or the word library, your head spins around. Politicians will hear you better if you can hook what you have to say to things they care about. The other thing here is this is about outcomes, not inputs or outputs. So much as we love to count things in library land, that's not a good story. Good story, for example, is what happens when kids attend summer reading program? What change happens? And if you interview many elementary school teachers, they'll tell you that kids who go to summer reading programs come back to school ready to go in a much different way than kids who don't. That's more important than how many kids attend it.
The adding value is one thing, and you should all have an inventory of all the things that add value. But one of the extra columns you should have on your chart is understanding what counselors see as being of value. And your MLA, what does your MLA see as being of value? And you need to do your research there so that you have an understanding of what makes decision makers tick. And then you begin to finesse some of your messages, and you begin to share your messaging on the same platform they are.
Okay, so once you figure this out, this is often the hard part for people in this community. You need to prepare answers that are called elevator speeches. 25 to 30 seconds. So that's the length of time you get to be in an elevator with somebody. If you're a person who likes to count words, it's about 80 to 90, or in sentences, it's 8 to 10, and I see that I've got a typo right there on the screen. From my own experience, when I was president of CLA, and we were dealing with the issue of the library postal rate, I got to actually ride in the elevator with lots of members of parliament, because the only time you could catch them was going from meeting to meeting, and I had my 25-second story about how if you cut postal rate, the people who are really affected are the people in rural communities in Canada. They're not getting any more the kind of library service they should be paying for. And at that time, we were successful in retaining it. We all love words. That's often how we end up in this profession or in this vocation. But not everybody loves listening for as long as we'd like to talk. So I've given you a link actually to a site that explains how to prepare an elevator speech, and it's a challenge I would throw out to you in terms of practicing a new skill.
One of our champions from the library community, Marie Logan from Wheatland, Alberta, she had a real favorite elevator speech that she would use to open conversations. And she would say, do you know that libraries are all the same size when they're connected electronically? And that would just open the door for, what do you mean? How does that work? But it was a very simple elevator speech, and it got a lot of mileage in Alberta as we were connecting libraries.
If you're a person that needs to practice elevator speeches, think of the question you got asked most often and have a good answer. So people say to me, oh, you're a librarian, do we still need those? I have a speech for that. Or do we still need libraries? Isn't everything free? I have a speech for that as well. So you just have those things, they become part of your conversation. The next thing to know, what are the funders' priorities? And this goes back to shaping your message so people can listen to it, or as Punch said, what's going to get their attention? Try to focus on the top 3, because there's always many and you'll get lost in them. And what does your library do that aligns with these priorities? And that helps you if you know who's the champion. Is there an MLA that's really interested in that stuff? Or is there somebody in your community who you really have to convince? And particularly now with the change of government, what's the Alberta message? So Punch and I were talking about, this is a government who's likely not going to appreciate an elitist perspective. They're going to want to know, what's the Alberta answer to all of these questions?
One of the ways that Ray Daniluk tried to get across the linking of library priorities and government priorities was in 2008. He encouraged every MLA, encouraged in capital letters, every MLA to visit a public library. And he, in fact, led a number of tours. The library community did a great job in terms of staging some of these tours, but it was always fantastic following along behind the MLAs after they had been shown the reference area, or treated to how databases have practical value. But to hear them all say the same thing, I didn't know libraries did that. And I guess that the message there about funding priorities is that you really do have to understand your MLA, and you have to be able to link what you're doing to some of their needs and some of the priorities that Margaret will talk a little bit about in the recent speech from the throne.
So It seemed to me that the government had very kindly arranged their affairs to suit Punch and I today, because we wanted an example to talk about. So the throne speech was yesterday, and there were three priorities that were identified in there that I think speak directly to libraries. And you may have others depending on where you are, but the one that really stood out for me is one of the lines in there is that the government will ensure high quality and effective frontline services to support all Albertans. So if libraries are a high quality frontline service, there's an opening. And the more you can reflect people's own language back to them, the better they'll hear you. So it's a matter of going through those things. Two of the other ones that I thought were pretty clearly opportunities for libraries, one of them was about certification of newcomers to Canada so that they can join the workforce. And I know that many of you have programs that help newcomers adjust to life in Alberta, right? That feeds into that government priority. There's another one about providing more options for education. And again, what is it that libraries do with kids or with homework clubs or with adolescents that feeds into those things? So it's a matter of reading government things, looking for the hidden fish hooks that you can hang library stuff on. See, I got a sports metaphor in there, just about.
Did you? Yes. In 2008, when we were doing the MLA review, another tactic that Ray Daniluk put in place, he had learned it from Shirley McClellan, who said, if you've got issues, create a crisis and assign an MLA to look after solving that crisis. Well, he assigned 3 MLAs to look into library issues. And we had been in Edson, the focus group people had left, and a school superintendent walked in. And he said, the biggest thing that you could possibly do for Alberta is to develop a standard preschool literacy program that was measured and researched. And we sort of looked at him kind of stunned. And he said, you don't know how much it costs the education system to deal with kids who show up in kindergarten and grade 1 far below the acceptable literacy level. As far as I know, Alberta has still not put in place a standard preschool literacy program that is measured.
Okay, so the rest of the other 2 things I picked out of the throne speech are here. The one that I think that provides some real opportunities for libraries, depending on how it evolves, is the educational choices. Because one of the things that public libraries do that they don't often talk about is support homeschooling, which is an educational choice. And it's a unique support because people who homeschool don't have access to the same resources as others. Up next, develop relationships. Sound like we're hoping for something happier. I was Punch is making a face at me that you can't see. So the question is, who can you work with? But also, who's going to be damaged if you're successful? If you get the money, who doesn't get it? Or, if you grow, does anybody get hurt? Based on this is, don't compete with or contradict other libraries. And you need to think about the Alberta Library Trustees Association. They have a role in this. How can they support you? And I'm going to come back to trustees at the end when I talk about who does what. What's LAA's role? What about AALT? And how many of you out there don't even know what that stands for? It's the Alberta Association of Library Technicians. What should TAL be doing for you? If you're a TAL member, you get to vote. You have input. What's TAL's role in coordinating or sustaining or building stuff here? And the one that public libraries often completely forget about is, what about academic libraries? How do they fit in with you? Could they be champions? Could they provide you with some help?
I'm going to take a little sidebar here
You bet.
in terms of developing relationships. For those of you who worked with me over the years, you know that I was a very spoiled public servant. And I don't know how it ever happened that I had access from almost day one to ministers, deputy ministers, ADMs, and that went all through my career until 2009. One of those fabulous relationships that I had was with the Mary Totman, who was the president of ALTA during whatever period of time that was. And Mary really was a library lover. And she knew what her role was in terms of supporting me as a public servant. She asked me to join her for lunch one day. And so she wanted to go up to St. Albert. So we went up to the restaurant in St. Albert, and they had these old-fashioned, very high booths. And so the waitress took me down towards this booth, and I couldn't see who was in there. And I was expecting Mary. When I turned the corner and looked in the booth, I saw Mary, but I also saw Mary O'Neill and Lois Hole. And I called those the three wise women because they maintained a relationship with me for many years as the unofficial deep throat, I guess you'd call it, deep throat trio working on behalf of public libraries. And many people didn't know this, but I had direct access to Lois Hole and her speechwriter. And so many interesting stories were sent by email to the speechwriter. But it's amazing what those relationships can do if you take the time to develop them and to make sure that you hold up your end of the bargain. And in my end of the bargain up until now was secrecy.
So on the next page, we've given you a couple of links of things that you should be aware of. And you'll see the third one is actually not from libraries at all, but rural municipalities of Alberta. And so you should be looking at partners beyond libraries and looking to see who's got the same kind of issues that we have in libraries and who we could work with. The other thing is, if you're a member of an association that does advocacy work or has an advocacy handbook, then how do you put pressure on them to meet your needs and consider whether they're providing you with the training you need, the backup documents you need, the stories you need to be successful. So don't forget that we do actually have friends that are not other libraries. That we need to make sure that we reach out to them and see how do we help them be successful so they can help us be successful. Okay. The next one is as the first one was Punch's line, this is my line. Don't assume malice. And there's many quotes around this. There's a Nobel Prize winner, Richard Feynman, who talks about don't assume malice for things that could be explained by stupidity. I've kind of molded that to say don't assume malice for things that can be credited to just lack of good information. And that should drive our advocacy work. What do funders need to know in order to make good decisions? And so right now I'm going to ask every one of you, have you congratulated your MLA, regardless of what you think of who got elected? Have you congratulated them and invited them to come and see your library for a tour? What about your municipal councilors? Have they all had a walkthrough? This is not about making them into library users. This is making them into informed decision makers. And you really need to stage these tours. The more you know about the people, the better you can do it. They like dogs, you got a dog theme. I'm going to let Punch tell the good story about that one. But the bottom line here is government is not the enemy. And, you know, in Alberta, we've had a conservative government for, I don't know, forever, until except for the last little while. And during that time, libraries had remarkably stable and supportive funding from the government. So this is not the time to assume things are going to go wrong. And it's not about being party political. It's about being aware that people make decisions. It's their job. They've been elected to do that. And our job is to make sure that they have good information when they're doing that.
Just a hint, when you decide to invite MLAs into your library, and you want to show them this fabulous database that you have, please be sure that you know how to run that database. There's nothing more embarrassing than to have an MLA sitting in front of a screen and you're fumbling away, not knowing how to use the database. One of the tours that Ray Daniluk ran was through Edmonton Public Library. And one of the things that he wanted to illustrate to MLAs was how the diverse uses that people make of the library. And he introduced them to a woman who was an author, and we were sitting at a very low coffee table. And she talked about how she used the library. And she talked for about 20 minutes. And by the time she finished her little talk, she had a whole series of books sitting on the coffee table. And she said, all of these books were written in this library. And Ray was just trying to illustrate to them that libraries have a great many uses, and that being creative and using the resources within the library can result in some fantastic creations.
Okay, so if you need to find out what funders have said, this is what librarians are good at. Look stuff up. So there are best practices for public libraries. If you're looking for a starting place, there's some good information in there. A role that we often forget is the federal government. The reason I put this out there right now is the federal government is doing a cross-country checkup to do with their role in interlibrary loan. And so that's something that some of us should be providing input to, because while it operates behind the scenes, we don't want to find that it's operating behind the scenes in a way that is not beneficial to how we operate. Move on. Next thing, try and have a common message. And in communications, there's a thing called the rule of three, which is that three things is about as many as most of us can juggle at any one time. So if you're gonna go to anybody, try to restrict yourself to 3 messages. And I just have to say here, because I've heard this so many times, we need more money is not a message. It just somehow it never sells what you need to sell. We need more money. The last thing you should always say when you're talking to somebody is, how can we help you, whether it's the provincial government, it's the department, it's your municipal council, how can we help you meet your goals? That's the message to leave people with. But your common message you should also have in your briefing book, all those questions that come up over and over again. And I'm sure that you could talk across the province and we would come up with the same list. My favorite always, why are there so many libraries in this community? From people who don't understand that school libraries and public libraries and courthouse libraries and academic libraries do something different. My favorite, isn't everything free? One of my colleagues just told me that they figured out that at their library, the average ebook is costing them $85. So because we throw the word free around, like free public libraries, we need to be careful that people don't get confused and think that that means things really are free. And of course, who needs libraries now? We have the internet. So you're going to have answers to those questions in your briefing book.
When I came into the library community was at war with the provincial government. And the public library review was sort of the discussion area. And one of the frustrating things that the government, the MLAs had, was that the library people were coming at them with about 45 different issues, and they just couldn't get their head around this. After a period of time, we were able to work with the library community and come up with the 3 most important issues that they had. And we began to develop common messaging that every library used. It was a script that was used. And they went to their MLA with that script and that pitch and those 3 issues. And the value of that was that when the MLAs all got together around the coffee pot just before the caucus meeting, they weren't saying, "Those bloody librarians are after me again for more money." It began to be, "You know what they're talking about in the library community?" And the other MLA would say, "You know, I heard exactly the same thing." And everyone gradually got on the same page and began to understand what those key issues were for libraries. And that became the way we worked the wedge into the door to diffuse a lot of the issues between the government and the library community.
So when you're trying to figure out the common message, I've given you kind of some clues. And the first one I think we should always be able to answer anyway, and that's, how do libraries in Alberta help the government to meet its goals in a cost-effective way? And we have lots of stories about that. And the second question is, how do the benefits that libraries give you outweigh the costs? And I'm going to lead you on the next page. I've given you a link. There's from Ontario, there's a value calculator online that helps you figure out the value that you contribute. Now, a caution in this was developed in another province with a different political situation and a different funding model. So if you decide to use it, make sure that you are able to explain the assumptions and decisions behind the calculations, or you won't be convincing. So you need to personalize it. And I know, for example, that Yellowhead Regional Library is doing some work with this to figure out how they can make it much more focused on Alberta. But it's a really interesting way of looking at value versus cost. And that's a question because we have to be able to answer, because when people see the balance sheet and they see the financial documents, they see the money, but the value doesn't appear on there. Any more there?
No.
Okay. We're getting there. So the next one is find your champions. And those are the people who are going to go out on a limb for you. They're going to speak on your behalf. They're going to understand your issue. And who do they know? And how does that work in your community? So we were just talking before the beginning of this webinar, when I lived in Lacombe, many decisions in my community at that time occurred in the hotel coffee shop or at Rotary. So needing to know that about your community is where do things happen so that you can ask for help?
Those champions can be your trustees, they can be counselors, they can be high-profile users in your library, they can be articulate, invisible almost users in your library. Finding the right media people that can be supportive can be your champions. Your key political people or high-profile people in the community are worthy of your time. Shirley McClellan, her interest in public libraries went before she was a politician, and she worked in community literacy. And Ray Daniluk's connection to public libraries was very emotional. And his connection was that he didn't speak English when he started school. And it was the librarians that taught him how to speak English. And he never, ever forgot that. When you're working with your champions, some of them can leap over tall buildings. They really can. And Shirley McClellan and Ray Daniluk were two of those people who could leap over tall buildings. Shirley McClellan, her predecessor, Gary Marr, he came up with the phrase, we should connect all of the libraries electronically. So he had cabinet approve that. So that was the good news. The bad news was he never had any money. But it was Shirley McClellan, when no one else was getting money in Alberta, Shirley McClellan found $4.6 million to build Applin. And we took that money, and using her guidance politically, we're able to work with the federal government and move that money up to about 13 or 14 million. Treating your champions well, with respect, and never burning them is extremely important. That, I guess, is best illustrated with Shirley McClellan, who, after she left the library community, when she left the library community, I'll go there first. When she left the library community, she was given a coat made from traditional library material, and her assistant was given a vest. She never ever forgot that. In 2005, I had to let the library community know very, very subtly that there wasn't going to be any new money for them in 2006. In January of that year, Shirley McClellan had become the treasurer for the province. And her phone started to ring. And it rang constantly until early March 2006. And it was mostly coming from her own constituency. The libraries in her constituency were making those calls. On March the 6th, we received a message that Alberta Libraries received the largest single sum of money in Canadian history, when we were given 20 million. We were able then to figure out, that was the good news, the 20 million. The bad news was we had to spend it by the end of March. So we were very creative in terms of how we distributed the money, and got libraries funding, extra funding for 2 years, and a whole pot of special project money. But it was because a champion didn't forget.
So on the next page, for those of you who aren't really sure how to go about this, I've provided you with a link that actually talks about how to develop and sustain your champions and how to thank them. I think the thing I keep going back to, though, is that they don't have to be library users. Getting people to use the library is about marketing. Getting people to support the library is about advocacy. And in my own case, when I was a public librarian, there were 2 realtors in the city I was working in who loved the library because they said that it was easier to sell houses in an area where there was a public library. I never saw them in the library. I saw them at business events in the town. But don't forget, I mean, they see a lot of people, right? They were the ones that let us put library material in packages for people they sold houses to. And so they were true library supporters, but definitely not users.
Some of your program initiatives, you'll find that there are champions in those groups. When Ray Daniluk did his tours, libraries would bring community people together to speak about the library, not for them to speak on their behalf, but to have the cultural community talk about what the public library was doing for their particular community. whether it was English as a second language, whether it was special tutoring, all things that maybe Ray didn't understand or didn't know about, but they were utilizing the champions within their user groups, and they were extremely effective.
Oops, I'm going the wrong way here. So this is number 10, and it's a rule for advocacy: like speaks to like. And so I know that there's trustees listening in here, and I know there's librarians and other library staff listening in here, and other people. But as a rule of thumb, elected officials, which in library land is the trustees, should be speaking to elected officials. So that's your MLAs and your counselors. Employees, so library staff, should speak to other employees. So your provincial staff, your civil servants, but also your municipal staff. So the accountants and the finance people and all of those other people in your municipality. And government departments, I believe, should be speaking to other government departments. The reason for this, and I often have heard trustees say, but my librarian knows a lot more than I do about this, is that if librarians go talking about money to funders, it always appears as if they're being self-serving and looking at their own salaries. And I've heard that so many times from municipal councils, from county councils, and even from the province. So who are you here to ask us to give you more money so you can make more? Whereas trustees represent the community. They represent everybody out there. And so when they talk about the need for libraries, they are speaking on behalf of the community, not on behalf of themselves.
I think the key word there is speaks. The library community needs to speak to obviously the elected officials. They need to speak to the staff within the library's branch. They have to make sure that they are on side, that they understand what your issues are, and that they hopefully will be able to share some of the challenges that they're faced with. So you can then go around and be able to be supportive of them. The role that they have in the branch has in terms of internally in government is to be your advocate at every single meeting, whether it's with the Department of Education and talking about the role that public libraries play in supporting the educational agenda, whether it's communicating with Service Alberta about the technology developments that public libraries are putting in place, whether it's with other aspects of municipal affairs, showing how libraries can be used as meeting places using their conference center type equipment. They have a responsibility to act on your behalf across government.
We're just coming to the end, and we have about 5 minutes left, so I think we can each wrap up with a story. I'm going to tell you the story I'd like you to tell. I'm going to start with my story, though. Before I was ever a librarian, I was always a library supporter, and this occurred in BC, so you don't have to try and figure out who it was. There was an issue in the library, and I went to speak to my municipal councillor about the library and trying to engage his support for moving forward on this problem. Now, I have to tell you, I was very young then, which explains what happens next. He said to me, quite frankly, the junior councillor in this town gets the dog problem, the garbage problem, and the library board. And I'm much more interested in the dog problem and the garbage problem. I couldn't believe it. I was amazed. So being young and kind of brave and not very thoughtful, when the election came around shortly thereafter, I got my friends and we campaigned for his competition. Just because I thought somebody who believes that is not somebody that I want in my village. And I didn't know much about advocacy, but it seemed like that was the beginning of a lifelong journey of telling the library story and making sure people have better information than he apparently had. If you don't have another story, Punch.
Oh, yes, I do.
I was wondering about Ray and his motorcycle.
Okay, I could tell that story. When we did the tours, Ray's tours, he wasn't very computer literate. And so we thought, well, he should at least be aware of the databases. Heaven help us and these databases. The library staff did some research, and Ray stepped up to the computer and they said, well, we want to illustrate how you can use these databases very, very practically, Mr. Danila. They said, we heard you ride a motorcycle. And he said, yes, I do. I drive a Harley. And they said, oh, and they punched in the Harley information. And as the story unfolded, they got more and more specific and actually came up with the manuals to help him fix his Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Ray turned around to them and said, well, smarty pants, what am I going to do when I'm out on the highway and my motorcycle breaks down? They said, well, don't you use a BlackBerry? And he said, yes, I do. And lo and behold, up on his BlackBerry came the same manual. And he was absolutely astonished at this database technology. The parting words from my side of the table, I guess, is about, in advocacy, it's about listening to the folks, which is a very old community development term. And it's not just listening to your supporters, but it's listening to everyone. It's listening to the naysayers. It's listening to the people in line in the grocery store. It's listening to your community. And that's a key thing that you have to develop a skill for, is that patience in listening to people about libraries.
But I guess my bottom line is that advocacy is about building relationships with people, talking to them, helping them see in a way that's meaningful to them why good libraries are good for everybody. So we have an email address. So if you have questions, you can send them to us at advocacy@thealbertalibrary.ab.ca, and we will answer them. You don't know who you might get an answer from. It might be one or both of us, but we do undertake to answer it. And I think our hour is up.
Yeah, I guess.
I think we're blessed in Alberta having the organizations we do. When I look on the screen there and see some of the people, some of you, I've watched some of you move from small communities to larger communities, and how you have, some of you have done very, very well in terms of your ability to age well.
Gee, thanks, Punch. Okay, I think that's us for now. Goodbye.
All right. So up here.